Constitution provided the model for state constitutions, which in turn implied new public buildings for new political functions. Taking these points one at a time, we find that a few buildings of national importance were being built in 1788 and 1789, the years of the campaign for ratification. And these buildings were symbolic of the new political order. Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, the French designer and engineer who would soon develop the plan for Washington, D.C., erected an immense temporary pavilion in New York City in July of 1788 to celebrate the ratification of the Constitution by New York State, the 11th state to do so. The pavilion, with its 10 branches converging on one, is symbolic. 3 days after the celebration, a Massachusetts newspaper published a cartoon and poem symbolizing the ratification process as the process of building the federal edifice. L'Enfant was also given the job of remodeling the old New York City Hall to make it ready for the first session of Congress and the inauguration of President Washington in the spring of 1789. Federal Hall, as the building came to be known, would soon serve as our national Capitol building for 17 months only until Congress moved to Philadelphia. And you can see the hysteria here after the news came out that they were going to move down to Philadelphia. They thought it was the devil's work. The move to Washington was still 10 years away. If the ratification of the Constitution created the need for ceremonial structures and provisional public buildings, it also created a second need, the need for long-range planning for a national capital. An essential feature of the Constitution was that it confirmed the three branches of government, the executive, legislative, and judicial, and this basic division became, in effect, the architectural program for the new federal capital of Washington, D.C., projected, planned, and built so far as could be expected during the 1790s. The division of powers in the Constitution was translated in architectural form and urban form into a Capitol building with chambers for the two houses of the legislature and the Supreme Court. And at the other end of town was a president's house with 4 small buildings around it for the initial 4 executive departments: State Department, War Department, Navy Department, and Post Office Department. It was indeed a small town. It's hard to imagine that when the government moved from Philadelphia to Washington, there were only 130 government employees in all the departments. But Jefferson knew, and his planner L'Enfant knew, that it was a city planned for enormous future growth. The Constitution had its third impact on architecture and town planning through the simple fact that the document recognized the sovereignty of every state, the original 13 that formed the United States, and the dozens more that were soon to be added. Each state, as it patterned its own constitution on the federal document, needed to make provision for accommodating the 3 branches of state government in new or remodeled buildings, and sometimes an official governor's mansion. The westward movement of population in the decades since the pacification of the frontier during the Revolution created still another force in the development of state capitals. Legislators in more than half the states responded to the population shift by relocating state capitals inland from the original seats of government on or near the Atlantic coast to more centrally located towns, some newly founded, others now designated as state capitals. Virginia led the way in 1780 by moving the capital from Williamsburg to Richmond. South Carolina established Columbia in 1788. North Carolina established Raleigh in 1792. Secondary capitals, eventually to become the sole state capitals, were established in Connecticut in 1793, with Hartford joining New Haven as the government center. And the same thing occurred in New York in 1804, with Albany joining New York City as the center of government. Georgia moved its capital to Milledgeville in 1805. Pennsylvania began building a new capital in Harrisburg in 1810. Only in Massachusetts were maritime interests strong enough to resist an inland move. The capital did not move to Worcester, as proposed in 1793, but stayed in Boston. These new state capitals needed everything, from new government buildings to hotels, taverns, stores, churches, for the seasonal accommodation of the legislators. Many of the state capitals that stayed where they had been also needed new buildings, having outgrown their old colonial state houses, particularly where these older buildings included the city hall, as in New York and Boston. Thomas Jefferson and Charles Bulfinch enter the picture of architecture in 1787 in this very matter of the construction of new state government buildings. A state capitol building for the decade-old town of Richmond, and a new state house for the century-and-a-half-old city of Boston. Where were these two men in 1787? The answer tells us a lot about their sensibility, the sensibility each would bring to these building tasks. Jefferson was in Europe in 1787, and Bulfinch was just returning from there. Jefferson had been in Paris as American ambassador since 1784, and he would remain there until 1789, when he returned to America to become Secretary of State in the Washington administration. Bulfinch had been traveling around Europe as a gentleman on a gentleman's grand tour since the middle of 1785, and early in 1787 he would return to Boston to begin his work as a gentleman amateur architect. The architecture they had the opportunity to observe in Europe was a distinctly new neoclassical architecture, showing a forceful synthesis of three things. First, of new archaeological discoveries involving both Roman and Greek ruins. Second, a canonical understanding of classical architecture handed down through Renaissance treatises. And third, a widening range of contemporary building tasks. The neoclassicism that Bulfinch and Jefferson assimilated was at once romantic and rational, fascinated by both the symbolic and compositional possibilities of classical buildings and classical building elements. We turn now to look at the designs of these men for the new state government buildings. Jefferson himself was the author of the 1776 bill to relocate the capital from Williamsburg to Richmond, and the legislature moved to temporary quarters there in 1780, still in the midst of the war. As governor of Virginia from 1779 to 1781, Jefferson took a personal interest in securing a design for the new capital. Then, in 1784, he sailed from Boston for France to serve as American trade negotiator and ambassador. A friend back in Richmond wrote discouraged to Jefferson in July of 1784. "I do not think the directors of the building committee believe it possible to build a more magnificent state house than the Williamsburg Capitol. It seems impossible to extend their ideas of architecture beyond it." Jefferson himself had been critical of the Williamsburg building. This friend, and others sympathetic with Jefferson's taste, may have persuaded the building committee to look further, because in March of 1785, the committee wrote to Jefferson asking him to consult with an architect concerning the design. Believing that he himself had the ideal concept for the building, Jefferson did not confer with an architect at this stage, writing back to Richmond in January of 1786 that in consulting an architect, experience shows that about once in 1,000 times a pleasing form is hit upon. Instead, he announced that he had discovered a prototype that could be adapted for the Richmond Capitol. This was the Roman temple called the Maison Carrée at Nîmes in the south of France, a building restored by Louis XIV and believed at that time, in Jefferson's words, to be the most perfect and precious remain of antiquity in existence. Jefferson had not yet seen the building. He knew it well, however, from illustrations in Palladio. And you wonder if he'd been considering the Maison Carrée even before arriving in France. At this stage, Jefferson did consult an architect. He asked the architect-archaeologist, Charles-Louis Clarisseau, to prepare a model of the Maison Carrée to guide the building committee back in Richmond, as well as plans and elevations showing the modification of the temple prototype for modern functional requirements. Jefferson later visited Nîmes in March of 1787, and his analytic approach to a classical architecture, known only through books, gave way to a romantic involvement, in both senses of the word, with the building itself. He wrote to a friend, "Here I am, madam, gazing whole hours at the Maison Carrée, like a lover at his mistress. Jefferson's design for the Richmond Capitol, clarified and given authority by Clarisseau's model and drawings, did guide the building committee and contractors through the years of his absence in Paris. The significance of this building lies in the choice of the temple prototype for a modern functional building. It is an important moment in cultural history. It is also an important moment in architectural history. That part of architectural history which is as much concerned with intentions and the history of ideas as with the history of design. As a design, the Richmond Capitol leaves much to be desired. Throughout, there is much awkward compromise between preconceived form and actual function. But this was the first modern building, to my knowledge, anywhere in the world to seek legitimization in the classical archaeological past. Earlier in the 18th century, small classical temples had been recreated as architectural features in English landscape gardens. But these buildings had few functional demands upon them, apart from the incidental entertainment of people out for a stroll. At a deeper level, it seems altogether appropriate that a built form associated with the picturesque garden should be translated into a symbol of democracy in the wilderness. Jefferson's Temple Capitol in Richmond was an answer, both sophisticated and naive, to the impression of a French traveler in 1791 that there is nothing old in America save the forests, the children of the earth, and liberty. While Jefferson's building in Richmond established the temple prototype for later state and local government buildings, Bulfinch's State House in Boston would be the first government building in America to incorporate a true dome with some dignity and some refinement. Jefferson's eclecticism in selecting the archaeological precedent of the Maison Carrée had been single-minded, one-dimensional, and antiquarian. Bulfinch's eclecticism was different in that it was informed by a variety of modern, newly completed buildings that he had seen during the decade between his departure for Europe and the beginning of the construction on the State House in 1795. Bulfinch's eclecticism was less dogmatic, more synthetic than Jefferson's, yet he too managed to create a prototype, the domed Capitol, that would stand as an even stronger image for later government buildings. In November of 1787, less than 10 months after returning from Europe, Bulfinch submitted drawings for a new State House, his first substantial architectural project. The Commonwealth had outgrown the space it shared with the municipal government of Boston, and the old colonial State House, the building that stood as the backdrop for the Boston Massacre in 1770. Bulfinch explained his 1787 design as being in the style of a building celebrated all over Europe. Specifically, he meant Sir William Chambers' Somerset House in London, a large government building completed during the American Revolution, a building that Bulfinch knew well from his stay in London during 1785. It had a porticoed section over there on the right, on a rusticated basement, and a somewhat diminutive dome above. Certainly a process of synthesizing the modern precedents was already at work in 1787 as Bulfinch prepared his initial design. It is actually fortunate that the project was shelved for 8 years as the Commonwealth debated the location of the new State House. Through this period of delay, the process of synthesis would continue, and Bulfinch, perhaps too freshly impressionable in 1787, could see other work, build other work, and mature as a designer. Among the buildings that Bulfinch assimilated in his revised design of 1795 was an American building, L'Enfance Federal Hall in New York. Bulfinch himself had seen the building when in New York for President Washington's inauguration in the spring of 1789. He even sent back a drawing of the building to a Massachusetts newspaper, which drew and engraved the Bulfinch drawing. Bulfinch needed Federal Hall to help him arrange the plan of the Massachusetts State House and to help decide the shape of some of the major spaces. In distinguishing Jefferson's symbolic, archaeologically based classicism from Bulfinch's synthetic, modern-based eclecticism. We are only saying that in the case of these two buildings, these two state capitals, Bulfinch's is the more interesting building. Not that Bulfinch is a better designer than Jefferson. Together, these two buildings, envisioned in the late 1780s and completed in the late 1790s, gave America the two prototypes that would strongly influence the design of state capitals, county courthouses, and city halls at least until the decade of the Civil War. Sometimes the two prototypes were combined, as in the Indiana State House of 1832. The result was certainly peculiar. In assessing the lifelong contributions of Jefferson and Bulfinch at the beginning of our own American architecture, we need to take into account two factors: the opportunities they had for actual building and the sensibilities they brought to bear on these tasks. Jefferson returned from Paris in 1789 to enter upon 2 decades of active political and cultural leadership at the national level, first as Secretary of State, then as Vice President, then as President. During this time, he conferred with L'Enfant on the planning of Washington, and with Latrobe and others on the design and construction of the United States Capitol. But because of his official duties, Jefferson designed relatively little in his lifetime. 18 buildings in all, some 13 houses and 5 public buildings, a capitol, 2 courthouses, a church, and a university. Only 16 of these projects were built, and only 13 are still standing. But 2 of Jefferson's projects, here's his remodeling of Monticello beginning in 1793, and his construction of the University of Virginia beginning in 1817, are truly extraordinary buildings, as fine as any ever built in America. We will return briefly to these as we look at the sensibility of Jefferson, the architect. Bulfinch, on the other hand, had a prolific building career, working as a gentleman amateur, as a developer, as a master builder, and finally, as a nationally respected professional. Bulfinch actually constructed some 76 buildings until his retirement around 1830. 51 of these were built in Boston between 1787 and 1817. We have to imagine, though, what an impact his work had in transforming that post-medieval wooden colonial city into a truly cosmopolitan city of brick government buildings, markets, wharves, row houses, and imposing townhouses. Bulfinch's work was visible everywhere in Boston, and it was this demonstrated accomplishment that struck President Monroe on his visit to Boston in 1817 and led the president to invite Bulfinch to Washington, where he spent the next 12 years completing the United States Capitol. This brings us to the matter of sensibility, and unavoidably the issue of quality. It is not as simple as saying that Bulfinch was an architect of quantity while Jefferson was an architect of quality. Bulfinch should best be remembered for establishing an easily understandable vocabulary of neoclassical building in brick in restrained geometric forms. This neoclassical vocabulary, high style by American standards, vernacular by European standards, would be disseminated for at least another generation through the builder's guides of Bulfinch's contemporary, Asher Benjamin. Bulfinch's sensibility was almost entirely formed by his European grand tour when he was 22, 23, 24 years old. He must have sensed a sharp contrast upon arriving from Boston in London in 1785, and an even sharper contrast upon returning back to Boston in 1787. He set about to supply and embellish Boston with neoclassical buildings for a variety of new urban functions, constructed on a scale appropriate to local resources. Bulfinch and Jefferson, both emerging as designers around the year 1787, were actually 20 years apart in age. When they first met in Paris in 1786, Jefferson was 43 and Bulfinch was 23. Jefferson simply had the advantage of his 20 years of looking and learning and doing. Jefferson had already built for himself 5 years before the Revolution a small country house at Monticello. The house we see today is his own complete remodeling of this earlier house. The difference in age and in experience made all the difference in the way that Bulfinch and Jefferson looked at and learned from Europe. Bulfinch sailed from Europe at the age of 22 in 1785. Jefferson had not even seen an American colonial city at that age in 1765. But his eyes were opened the following year when he traveled to New York, Philadelphia, and Annapolis. He saw his first architectural books, his first sophisticated buildings. Now, in having to depend on books for another 20 years for his understanding of architecture, it is not surprising to find Jefferson so susceptible to a symbolic antiquarian eclecticism in the design he prepared for the Richmond Capitol, even while living and working in the heart of modern Paris. Jefferson's years of looking and learning put him in a better position than Bulfinch to appreciate the directions of the new neoclassical architecture of Europe. Bulfinch saw ready-made prototypes in the recent architecture. Jefferson saw design solutions. Jefferson's two greatest works, Monticello and the University of Virginia, were highly personal works, each designed and constructed over more than a decade with real thought and ingenuity. In these works, we are far from the political realm and far from the need for legitimatizing modern functions through ancient forms. But at Monticello and the university, we are still in the civic realm, the realm where the public and private aspirations of Jefferson meet. The architectural synthesis is also complete. There is symbolic eclecticism in both projects, as seen in the derivation of the rotunda from the Pantheon of Rome by way of Palladio's 4 books of architecture. There's synthetic eclecticism in both projects, seen in the lessons learned from modern Paris buildings, from the Hotel de Salm at Monticello, from the Hotel Guimard at the University of Virginia. But there is also eclecticism at its best, creative eclecticism, indeed eclectic creativity in both projects. The configuration of spaces in and around these buildings has no precedent and needs none. The buildings hover between a landscape scale and a human scale, between a presence in the landscape and a human presence. The civic realm of Monticello is a reflection of the public life of Jefferson during the years of his service in the national government. It was his retreat from public life to a private life that nonetheless made ample room for cosmopolitan international friendships. The civic realm of the university took the place of his national public life. It was the project of his retirement. It was the project that culminated his active architectural work. It was the academical village, which embodied so much of the need for architectural meaning that Jefferson felt from his earliest years at college in Williamsburg, to his years of critiquing colonial architecture, to his years of working in so many ways to promote a new federal architecture. Thank you. I'd be glad to say more about anything that I haven't said, or we can just come on up here and talk informally. Anybody have any thoughts on all this? Andy?
What's the process by which the nuclear classicism leaves the public realm and gets into other realms?
Through Palladio. That book really had a heavy hand, in some sense a deadening hand, on a lot of architecture all the way down through the 1850s. Jefferson, we didn't look at any of those buildings tonight, but many buildings in the Piedmont, many houses, country homes, were his works in that tradition. They're not very interesting works. They're works that don't really go very far to developing anything new. It's a long time, really. It's not until you get in A.J. Davis the synthesis of the analytic classicism. Davis used Duron at the same time he appreciated the Gothic in the way of wrapping up a building. It's not until you get down in the 1830s and 40s that you get really a creative ingenuity in the design of houses in America, or for that matter, in anything other than the public buildings. Jefferson didn't do much to push the architecture outside of that public realm. Bulfinch, on the other hand, did. The majority of his commissions were domestic commissions, and perhaps the greatest number of surviving commissions are the houses. But I look at them as really vernacular buildings. They're box-like brick buildings, very modestly articulated, modestly decorated in the interiors. But they do exert a strong image all the way, again, down through the 1850s. All that vernacular federal architecture that sweeps across Route 40 is, in some sense, a result of not directly Bulfinch's work, but the propagation of that work through Asher Benjamin, through the Builder's Guides. You begin to get architectural books published in this country. First Builder's Guide is 1797. Those go through many editions. Hundreds of those were all around the country by the 1830s. Benjamin wrote 6 or 7 books, and each one probably an edition of 1,000 or so. That's a lot of architectural literature for the time. Gil?
I think it'd be fair to say that Jefferson might have been affected by the growing romantic ideologies in Europe at the time he was there. And I'm thinking the time that he's in France, the same time that David is painting the same kind of Roman or antique nostalgia paintings that are going to give rise to the romantic movement in the other visual arts. Would it be safe to call Jefferson a romantic?
I really believe that strongly. I don't, as I was saying to the people last week, I think that neoclassicism, this international neoclassicism, is really just a branch of a more pervasive international romanticism. And Jefferson certainly had his heart in the game as much as his head, and he really saw those things with a loving eye and with a sense of fantasy, with a sense of bringing back something that honestly never was, and bringing it into the realm of American life. He felt one of the things that capital in Richmond would do would be to give us something to emulate, give people who'd never been anywhere outside of Virginia something to look at and something to hold up as a model of architecture. But that was a pretty didactic aim, pretty didactic intent behind all that. Certainly then it had its effect. A lot of things were built as a result in that image. Vern? In 81, treaty in 83. So that, the question was, when did the revolution end, and what impact then would that have on what was going on in building activity?
From your examples, it occurs to me that it seems like we feel, at the time, felt very secure in what we were doing. No emphasis on, not necessarily fortification, but being so free to do these things without any fear of the British.
Well, there were British in the vicinity of Richmond. The capital moved up there, or the legislature moved up there from Williamsburg in 1780. And the British then came and surrounded the town in 81, and they actually had to close down the legislature for a short period of time, abandon the work, or abandon any planning. They hadn't begun any actual work on the Capitol then. But all during the Revolution, construction on the Maryland State House was continued. Not really finished until the early 1780s, and that's where the Treaty of Paris, or the treaty concluding the Revolution, was signed, in that newly completed ongoing building project of the Revolutionary period. But those were the exceptions. Everybody else had to drop what they were doing and pitch in some way. There just wasn't the economic, there weren't the economic resources to be building during that time. There were scarcely the economic resources to pay the army. So you don't see, with the exception of a few outlying prosperous areas which kept involved in international commerce, like Newport, Salem, Savannah, much architecture during the late 1770s and early 1780s. Things really came to a halt 1765, 1770. A whole generation of architecture is missing in this country. And that's why the buildings of the 1780s and 1790s are so striking, because they come on with entirely new image. And the image then begins to get into all aspects of architecture within the next 20 years. During the Revolution, between all the time of the Boston Tea Party, the beginnings of agitation in the cities, the beginnings of the confiscation of Tory property, people who had buildings of some prominence lost their properties, had to go up to Canada to escape getting involved in all the turmoil. But otherwise, there wasn't much. Certainly, people involved in the political cause were concerned with something much more abstract, much more demanding than actually building a house. Yes?
What would these two men think of the present revival of these classic moments in architecture?
I think they both would have an advantage. Question, repeat the question. What would both of these individuals, Bulfinch, Jefferson, think of the current drift back to neoclassicism, or back to classical form? I think they both would have a lot more resources to draw on than some of the people playing around with that kind of thing. You just, need I say more? As much as they were amateurs, they had figured out an awful lot, had looked at an awful lot, seen an awful lot, thought of it in its proper context, thought of it a little bit out of context, slightly romanticized, but they still knew how to get the right pieces attached to the other right pieces. Yeah. That may be it. Appreciate the intent, but not the method. Andy?
You said before about the political particularly in Jefferson. New architecture,
Well, he really was concerned with introducing a building type that would be easily grasped, easily transportable from Virginia on into the western states. And the very fact that he sent a model in a crate back to Richmond to guide the building committee is evidence of that. He thought that once they saw it, once they grasped it, they'd grasp it as a whole and understand the authority of those classical buildings. It was too early, though, for a real interest in what we'd then later call Greek revival and the whole enthusiasm with the campaign for independence in Greece. We're still in what we'd call a Roman revival. We're in a revival that is influenced by the archaeology of Italy and the archaeology of the Adriatic.
For instance, you see there an attempt to gain independence from Greek architecture.
Maybe that's the reason for going back to something as basic as the Roman temple. Bulfinch, of course, being from a relatively a town like Boston, which depended quite heavily on British connections, felt more the need for the continuity. And most of his influences came out of London, modern London in the 1770s, 1780s. But I don't really have any, I don't have in Jefferson's own words that. I'd like to find it in Jefferson's own words. Maybe it's in other writings, maybe it's in the political writings, and then we could just then make the link. Tom?
I was curious, you used the phrase vernacular architecture in the United States. Vernacular compared to European architecture.
Right.
Vernacular to European.
Yes.
First of all, could you expand on that just a bit? And secondly, when did we stop being vernacular to European? Did it feel, I'm sure it was much later on, but I was...
Yeah. Well, I have my own view on that. I think that the buildings certainly had an imposing quality when seen against the background of American buildings. They had sophistication, they had some real ingenuity involved. But I don't think that there was anything in any of the designers all the way through the first half of the 19th century which really would attract international attention. To my mind, the first architect who attracts international attention, who's worthy of being considered an architect in international circles, is Richardson. You really have to wait all the way down. H.H. Richardson in the 1870s, 1880s. I think it's fair to wait that long to make our claim that we've really done something worthwhile. Certainly there are a lot of buildings that are respectable, but they're not that much distinguished from a little out-of-the-way buildings in England, little out-of-the-way buildings in Prussia. They're not the prime examples of real inventiveness, real exploration of new ideas in design, as you see in Richardson by the time he really gets moving in the late 1870s, early 1880s. That's a pretty harsh assessment, but otherwise, we're really, I think, spending a lot of time glorifying things that give us pride as Americans, but they really don't hold up architecturally. Well, Richardson's first claim to fame was winning the competition for Trinity Church in Boston on Copley Square. He went on from that to build many buildings in suburban Boston, many libraries, little town halls, commuter railroad stations. He really grabbed a hold of a whole new series of building problems: architecture for a new suburban America, architecture for an America that depended on the railroad, for an America that depended upon people living outside of the cities, coming into the cities by the railroad to work downtown. New office buildings, major new public buildings for Chicago, Pittsburgh, St. Louis. There was a great new leap in building scale and building conception with Richardson. The buildings that we have in this part of the country once had a Chamber of Commerce in Cincinnati, the Marshall Field Wholesale Store in Chicago, the county buildings, the Allegheny County buildings in Pittsburgh. Glessner House, yes. Still, you can see that, yes. Fine house, just holds the corner and makes a real... Out west of the city, it's not Oak Park, but what's the neighborhood? People who know Chicago. 18, right on the... Okay. We've got it pinpointed on the map. Yeah. South. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
They had steps going up on the road here to Black Porch.
Right.
I'm not sure what I saw was a sketch of the original building with the old staircase coming down to the side.
Right.
Current picture has steps.
Right.
Was that original?
The original steps were on the side, and not until the remodeling of the building in several campaigns down through the later 19th century and early 20th century was were the steps put there on the portico front.
Tell me a little bit about what the architects would have talked about when they go in to remodel something that would almost become sacred.
Such as Jefferson's building, the way it originally had been completed. Well, they were a compromise. We really have a confused and complicated building problem here because Jefferson was absent for almost the entire time that the building was under construction. He had to communicate his intentions back to Richmond by way of this model, drawings, letters. He had people looking out for his interests back there in Richmond, saying what was going right and what was going wrong. The biggest problem of all was that the foundation was started before the temple was selected as the prototype for the building. So they were constrained by a building plan that was already, or had started out to be something else. The other problem was the problem of fitting in the spaces for the legislature and the public halls within the temple, and Jefferson had really very little say in that. So it was really just a matter of the local builders, the local contractors, fitting it all in the way that they were familiar with, and perhaps there were echoes of the State House, the original Capitol down in Williamsburg, where the entrance was off to the side. The Capitol, by the way, that we see in Williamsburg today is not the Capitol that Jefferson knew. It's a recreation of the Francis Nicholson Capitol of 1699, 1703. So in a way, it's an anachronism within Williamsburg. But there were many factors, and I think it was mostly a matter of the building project being in other hands, and really what was happening during the restoration, during the completion of the building, extension of the building during the later 19th century, was a return more to Jefferson's own intentions. The creation of the steps as envisioned in the model.
So that's probably how it's sold.
Right. Same thing, you can say the same thing for the work in Washington, D.C. around the turn of the century, where the L'Enfant plan, which had been eroded considerably, was then reinstated, and it was really a problem of the historic restoration of an entire 18th century concept in taking the original neoclassical plan for Washington and bringing it into the 20th century. Follow up on that?
On the Richmond Capitol, if you get that slide back up, point to some things that reflect the romantic influences you referred to.
Well, I'd be hard-pressed to see it actually in the building. I think it's more a matter of the attitude toward the selection of the temple as a prototype for the building. The fact that Jefferson knew this building as probably the one and only really intact temple anywhere in Western Europe that could be seen and studied. The fact that when it was represented in sketches, in archaeological sketches, in paintings, showing it fancifully in its original context, it was represented with other monuments drawn into the picture, other monuments that were in the vicinity but not in the immediate panorama. So there was the sense that this was one of several precious remains of antiquity that took even greater glory from the fact that it was near the aqueduct, that it was near the theater. What were some of the other buildings in Nîmes that would have figured in there? Was a Tholos-like building. All four of these figured in various ways into these vedute, or the idealized views. It's the inspiration, the attitude toward the choice of the building, and the fact that he really wanted to get down there and see it face to face and have that romantic experience of looking at it, contemplating it, sketching it, thinking of its place in that fragment of Roman life, that vestige of Roman civic life that he, of course, could imagine fairly well. But it's that imagination, the factor of the imagination that enters in that makes all this romantic. Yep.
Was it his right at the time to be in the architecture of the New Republic, referring to the architecture of the Old Republic, even wrong?
Again, I'd like to see that in Jefferson's words. I think with a little bit more digging, we could find some backup for these attitudes, for some of the ways that Jefferson perceived the buildings in the same way that he perceived the politics. Scott?
Would you describe Bulfinch's influence as more localized than Jefferson and more?
Would you stand? We can't hear your question.
Would you describe Bulfinch's influence on a more local scale in the Boston and New England area as opposed to
Jefferson's having more of a national?
That's fair to say, but it's a matter of circumstance. Jefferson, from the moment he returned to this country, was thrown into public life in the national government, serving as Secretary of State for Washington, then as Vice President under Adams, and then as President from 1801 to 1809. So all that he could barely get back to Charlottesville to supervise some of the work on Monticello during those years. It's a wonder that that building was carried out. He had his own localized impact in Albemarle County and the Piedmont of Virginia. Many of these country houses that I alluded to but didn't show were examples of Jefferson's own localized influence. But certainly there were buildings in the plan of Washington that were never built. He, at one point, thought of building the President's house, what we now call the White House, along the lines of Palladio's Villa Rotunda. He had proposed the same thing for the governor's mansion in Richmond. He had a major role, again, which we haven't gone into, in the guiding of the Capitol Commission through many architects and many setbacks in construction and design responsibility. Bulfinch, on the other hand, came back to Boston and served in many different capacities. He was town selectman, so he was involved in both the public and private sector in promoting his own building at the same time as he was passing judgment, guiding the building generally, guiding the background building of Boston. But as I said, perhaps 3/4 of his buildings are right there, certainly 2/3 of his buildings are in Boston. There's another good band of them in the counties immediately surrounding Boston. And there are not too many more buildings outside New England. The completion of the Capitol in Washington, which of course then was superseded in the 1850s by the new cast iron dome, was one of the rare examples of building outside of New England. Okay, well,
Jay, thank you so much.
thank you all for hanging out.